Snow fell in slow spirals over a frozen Polish field in March 1939. Captain Erich Voss stood shoulder to shoulder with his Wehrmacht platoon, rifles leveled at a dozen unarmed civilians, men, women. A boy no older than 12. The order crackled from the Oberst. Clear the village. No witnesses. Every finger tightened on the trigger, except one. And then he made a decision no one was prepared for. Which country are you watching from? By early 1939, Nazi Germany had perfected the machinery of quiet terror. Not yet war, officially, but occupation, intimidation, and preventive cleansing of border villages had become routine. The Wehrmacht, still clinging to the myth of its honor, was being drawn deeper into acts that blurred the line between soldier and executioner. Orders came not in writing but in whispers. Make it look like resistance. In remote hamlets like Zabor's, silence was enforced not by law but by fear. One wrong look, one withheld salute, and entire families vanished by dawn. The stakes weren't just death, they were complicity. To obey was to survive. To question was to risk everything. And in that gray moral twilight, even hesitation could mark a man for ruin. The German High Command understood the power of conformity. Units were rotated, officers reassigned, and dissent smothered before it could spread. Yet they also knew that one act of refusal, public, calm, undeniable, could crack the illusion of unity. That's why such moments were rare. Not because men lacked conscience, but because the price was too high. Dishonorable discharge, prison, or a bullet-marked deserter. In Zabor's, the villagers were accused of harboring Polish saboteurs, though none were found. The real crime? Their existence near a newly drawn border. The platoon had been told this was necessary discipline. But necessity, Erich Voss would soon prove, was not the same as justice. Military law in the Third Reich left little room for moral ambiguity. Article 47 of the Wehrmacht Penal Code demanded unquestioning execution of lawful orders. But what made an order lawful? That question haunted a few, whispered in barracks after lights out. Most chose silence. Survival required it. Yet in Zabor's, the line had shifted. These weren't soldiers. They were farmers, teachers, a widow clutching her rosary. The firing squad had been assembled not for combat, but for spectacle, a warning to other villages. If this succeeded, dozens more would follow. If it failed, someone would have to answer for failure. And failure, in Hitler's Germany, always demanded a scapegoat. Erich Voss was not a rebel by nature. Born in Stuttgart in 1907, he joined the Reichswehr at 20. Drawn not by ideology but by tradition, his father and grandfather had both served the Kaiser. He believed in discipline, duty, and the soldier's code. Protect the innocent, honor your oath, never shoot a man in the back. He'd watch with unease as the brown church rose, as synagogues burned in 38, as officers he respected were quietly purged. But he stayed, not out of loyalty to Hitler, but out of faith in the army itself, that it might yet be a bulwark against chaos. That belief was about to be tested in the snow outside a barn with no door. Voss had failed once before, in 1934, during the Night of the Long Knives. Ordered to secure a barracks where SA officers were being detained, he'd heard screams through the walls. He did nothing. Later, he learned 12 men had been shot without trial. The shame never left him. He swore then that if ever faced with true injustice, he'd act, not with grand speeches, but with simple refusal. He trained harder, rose faster, kept his mouth shut. His superiors called him reliable. His men called him cold. But in truth, he was waiting for the moment when silence would become betrayal. That moment came on a Tuesday morning in March, when the order came to execute civilians under skies so gray it seemed God had turned away. Voss's strength wasn't in words, but in stillness. He rarely argued. He never raised his voice. In maneuvers, he moved with precision. In briefings, he listened. His platoon respected him not because he was kind, but because he was fair. He corrected mistakes without humiliation, shared rations when supplies ran low, and never reported minor infractions. This quiet consistency built trust that would matter more than bullets in the hours ahead. He carried no religious medallion, no diary of protest. Just a pocket watch from his father and a worn copy of Clausewitz's On War, in which he'd underlined one sentence. War is a continuation of policy by other means, but never the abandonment of humanity. The warning came the night before. Oberstbrandt, a lean man with eyes like flint, gathered the officers in the schoolhouse-turned-headquarters. "Tomorrow's the Boers," he said, tapping the map. "They've been warned. They ignored us. Today, they learned the cost of defiance. No names were given. No evidence presented. Just a nod to the junior lieutenant. Prepare the firing squad. 10 civilians. Make it public." Voss didn't speak, but his silence was noticed. Brandt paused and added, "Any objection, Captain?" The room froze. Voss met his gaze and said only, "No, sir." But the hesitation, a half-second too long, was noted. Pressure built at dawn. The platoon assembled in the village square. Snow muffled sound, making every bootstep echo. The selected civilians were lined up against the barn wall, hands bound, faces pale but dry-eyed. A woman whispered a prayer in Polish. The boys stared at the ground. Lieutenant Kessler, barely 22, checked his men's rifles with trembling hands. "Keep steady," he muttered. Then Brandt stepped forward, his greatcoat crisp, his voice sharp as ice. "Ready? Aim." The click of hammers cocking was deafening. Voss raised his rifle like the others, but his finger hovered. Kessler glanced at him, confused. "Captain?" No answer. The silence stretched. Fear spread like frost. Young Private Muller, who'd shared bread with the boy just days before, began to shake. Another soldier, Hoffman, lowered his barrel a fraction. No one spoke, but doubt rippled through the line. In Nazi Germany, hesitation was contagious. Brandt sensed it. His jaw tightened. "Captain Voss," he barked, "is there a problem?" The wind stilled. The villagers held their breath. Even the birds seemed to pause mid-flight. All eyes turned to Voss. To obey was to live. To refuse was to die. But to stand motionless in that moment, to let silence speak, was something entirely new. Voss didn't lower his rifle. He didn't raise it higher. He simply stood, eyes fixed ahead, finger resting beside the trigger. "I cannot fire, sir," he said, quietly, without drama. The words landed like stones in deep water. Brandt's face darkened. "Repeat that." "I cannot fire on unarmed civilians," Voss said again, this time louder. "They've committed no crime." A gasp ran through the ranks. The boy looked up. The woman stopped praying. Brandt stepped closer, his breath visible in the cold. "You are relieved of duty. Hand over your sidearm." Voss didn't move. Under whose authority? Oberst? Military law? Or party decree? Brandt's hand twitched toward his Luger. For a heartbeat, the entire village seemed to hold its breath. Would he shoot him on the spot? Would the platoon follow? But Brandt hesitated. Killing an officer in front of his men, without trial, risked mutiny. Even in 1939, the Wehrmacht clung to procedure. "You'll face a court-martial," he growled. "And you'll hang." Voss nodded. "If that is justice, then so be it." Then, slowly, he unslung his rifle and laid it on the snow. The metal gleamed dully in the weak light. No one moved to pick it up. In that stillness, something shifted, not just in the Boers, but in the hearts of every man who witnessed it. Brandt turned to Kessler. "Carry out the order." But the lieutenant's hands were shaking too badly to aim. He looked at his men. Muller shook his head, almost imperceptibly. Hoffman stared at his boots. The platoon, once unified, now fractured by one man's refusal. Brandt's voice rose. "Do it, or you'll all answer for this." But the moment had passed. The spell was broken. No one raised their rifle. The firing squad stood frozen, not in fear, but in shared shame. The civilians watched, bewildered. The boy took a step forward. No one stopped him. In that terrible, beautiful silence, violence lost its power, not because it was defeated, but because it was refused. Voss turned to the villagers. "Go," he said in Polish, a language he'd learned as a boy. "Now, while you can." The woman grabbed the boy's hand. They ran, not toward the woods, but straight past the German line. No one fired. Brandt stood rigid, his authority crumbling with every passing second. Then Voss did something no one expected. He walked to the center of the square, removed his officer's cap, and placed it on the ground. "If you execute them," he said to Brandt, "you do it alone, with your own hands." It was a genius move, not defiance, but invitation. To shoot unarmed civilians alone, in daylight, without soldiers to share the guilt, Brandt couldn't. The power flipped not with a shout, but with stillness. Brandt, trained in command, found himself trapped by the very system he served. To kill the villagers alone would make him a murderer, not a soldier. To order his men again risked outright refusal, and to retreat would signal weakness. He chose the only path left. Save face. "This village is under new surveillance," he announced, voice strained. "Return to barracks." The platoon turned as one, relief and guilt warring in their eyes. Voss didn't move. He waited until the last bootstep faded, then knelt and picked up his cap. The villagers remained, stunned. One by one, they bowed, not in fear, but in gratitude. What made Voss's act irreversible wasn't just his refusal. It was that he made others see their own choice. He didn't preach. He didn't accuse. He simply stood, and in doing so, forced every man to ask, "What would I do?" In that frozen square, obedience became visible as a choice, not a duty. And once seen, it could never be unseen again. The Nazis built a regime on the illusion of inevitability. This is how things are. You have no choice. But Voss proved otherwise. Choice always exists, even in terror, even in uniform, even when silence is the safest answer. Back at headquarters, Brandt filed a report, but omitted Voss's name. He wrote that resistance was deemed unnecessary after civilian cooperation improved. A lie, but a necessary one. To admit an officer defied orders and succeeded would invite chaos. Other officers heard whispers. Some called Voss a traitor. Others, in private, poured him a drink. "You've made it harder for all of us," one colonel muttered, but his eyes said otherwise. The high command never pursued charges, not because they were merciful, but because they feared what a trial would expose, that the Wehrmacht's loyalty was not absolute, that some still remembered what it meant to be a soldier, not a killer. The platoon never spoke of Zabor's again, not in letters, not in barracks, but they carried it. Muller wrote to his mother that he'd seen something good in the East. Hoffman later refused to participate in a reprisal in Belarus and was transferred to a desk job. Kessler, who trembled that day, survived the war and named his first son Erich. As for Brandt, he requested reassignment to the Western Front within the month. No one questioned it. In the silence that followed Voss's stand, obedience became heavier to bear, and courage, once witnessed, could not be unlearned. That night, Voss walked alone to the edge of the forest. He lit a cigarette, his first in years, and stared at the stars. No triumph, no relief, only exhaustion. He thought of the SA men in 34, of the boy in the square, of the woman's silent nod. He hadn't saved them all. He hadn't changed the Reich. But he hadn't become what they wanted him to be. That was enough. Later, a young Polish priest found him there. "Why did you do it?" the priest asked in broken German. Voss exhaled smoke into the cold. "Because someone had to be the first to stop." Voss was reassigned to a supply depot in Silesia, effectively exiled but alive. He never saw Zabor's again. The villagers scattered when the war intensified, but stories of the German who didn't fire traveled through refugee camps and resistance cells. In 1943, a smuggled letter reached him, a drawing by the boy, now 16, of a soldier standing alone in snow. On the back, in Polish, "You gave us back our faces." Voss kept it in his pocket until the end. He never spoke of it. Some wounds aren't meant to heal. They're meant to remind. After the war, historians debated whether Voss's act mattered. No medals were awarded, no monuments raised. But in East Germany, a schoolteacher told her students the story every spring. In Poland, an old woman lit a candle for him each March 17th. And in military academies, his name became a quiet test. Would you have stood with him? The legend isn't that he changed history. It's that he proved history could be changed by one man choosing silence over slaughter. In the end, Courage isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's just the sound of a rifle not firing. Erich Voss's story reminds us that moral courage often wears no uniform but the one of conscience. If this moment moved you, like to honor those who chose humanity in hell. Subscribe for more untold World War II stories where silence spoke louder than guns. And asterisk comment below. Asterisk when have you chosen to say nothing so that violence wouldn't speak for you?